Frank Jackson, what are your earliest influence when it comes to politics? Who were your earliest influences?
Well, I am the youngest of four, over a 12-year span. My eldest brother, 12 years older. My father came from, my parents were late Victorians. My father came from Stoke, the potteries, and obviously went into the pottery industry. When he had, as an apprentice, became a skilled modeller in the sanitary ware business. When he became, when he finished his apprenticeship at 21, he was out of work and he went up to Scotland to work for Shanks of Barrhead, which of course still exists as part of the Armitage Shanks International Conglomerate. I don't think they have a place in Barrhead in Scotland anymore, but the name still exists. And there he met my mother and got married and did various things. But already before he moved to Scotland, as a teenager in the 1890s, he had joined the newly formed Independent Labour Party founded by Keir Hardie. So straight away you can see that what your question about my influence. He was a very active. He was never a national figure, although I think he could have done as good a job as many who were national figures. But nevertheless, he worked at his trade and was very active politically in Scotland initially, where I was born. And well, in fact, three of the family were born there. The one by accident happened to be born in England, but not where we were living there. And so I grew up in a political atmosphere. When I was just under 5, we moved back down south to Shropshire, where my father had, for the first time in his life, a really secure job. So I grew up there. And come 1945, the first post-war general election, I was just naturally got involved and did my first canvassing. But can I go back to my father's time in Scotland, because he suffered greatly from his political activity, and the particularly telling story is that he was putting up as a candidate, an independent Labour candidate for a local election. And I've never been able to track down exactly which election it was. My belief is that it was the Ayrshire County Council, but I haven't been able to confirm that. It might have been a more local one. But however, his boss at the time was the chairman of that local council, and he said, if you can imagine a proper Scots accent, I can't really do it, but I know, having one of my men sitting on the council with me, gave my father an ultimatum: either stand down as a councillor, as a candidate, or lose your job. What do you think he did? He stood by his principles and had a very hard time for several years following that. This was just around about the time when I was born, or was very young. So we had a very hard time I was born in 1928, of course, and the years immediately after that, before we moved to Scotland, to Shropshire in 1933, were very, very hard indeed. But that's my background, and so I have been active more or less in both the political and peace fields ever since. Nevertheless, I think I should say that I don't claim to have made any great achievements in that time. I've done my little bit, but I don't think it's false modesty to say that my achievements have been fairly minor.
So when did you move to Harlow, and how did you get involved in politics in Harlow?
I first of all, I left school at 15 and worked in the aircraft industry. This was in 1943, and during the war. I served an apprenticeship because from very early on, my ambition had been to be an aeroplane designer. And I got on the step towards that to a certain extent by serving an apprenticeship and ending up as a design draftsman. Eventually I became a senior design draftsman, a designer of bits of aeroplanes, but by that time I had other ambitions. I'd extended more, and I had studied for a part-time degree in physics. I was always interested in science anyway, and I decided that that's the line I wanted to pursue rather than continuing on the aeroplane side. It was very difficult. I took far too long over it because I was trying to do too many different things, including getting married and having my first child. But anyway, I eventually got my degree. I was then working for a company in London, which was moving out to Crawley, but I was still on the drawing board, and that was not what I wanted. It wasn't using my degree. I had the choice of going to Crawley and getting a nice new home in a new town, which was attractive, but still staying on the drawing board, or transferring to the company's research department, which was somewhere in Surrey, but I would not have the opportunity of the new home in the new town. Just at that time, a job came up in Harlow, and you say Don Anderson said he came for a job, a job which made use of my new qualification. It gave me a lovely brand new home for my wife and my son, who were really struggling in a grotty flat in London, and so it was such an obvious thing to do. I fancied the idea of new towns. Being socially conscious and knowing all about the post-war reconstruction and so on, and this was towards the end of 1960. And so I came in, I had an interview, I got the job.
Where was this?
This was for Cossor Electronics.
Okay.
And I came and I fitted in immediately. It was an absolute transformation in our lives. And my wife got over her problems that she'd been having. My son had the freedom to run around like mad instead of being restricted to a one-bedroom flat. And I fitted in with both my colleagues, and I had already known Stan Newens from our days in the Labour League of Youth in London. And I happened to, the first thing I did politically was to attend a co-op meeting, and there was Stan. And we greeted each other like old friends, as we were, and he introduced me to the political scene in Harlow. I went from there.
And what was the political scene like in Harlow? Was it active? Was it thriving?
Oh, it was fantastic, yes. It was really lively. Lots of people, like myself, who were socially conscious, generally left-wing. Martin Lawn was one of the first I was introduced to. I was living in my new house was in Rundles, and that was still at that time part of the Potter Street ward. As the town was growing, they were dividing up into new wards, and for the first year we were still part of Potter Street, and I became, my first significant political activity was as sub-agent for Bert Phelps, who was the one of the original Newtown councillors who was standing for re-election in, I think it was 62. 61. No, I think it was 62, and I was his sub-agent, and a very inefficient sub-agent. I had no idea what I was doing actually at the time, but I learned very quickly. So anyway, we then became a separate ward. Latin Bush was formed, and Martin Lawn, Jean Clark. Martin was chair. Jean Clark was secretary. I was membership secretary. Later became joined on as treasurer as well, but at the time we had a separate treasurer, and so we formed the new branch. And at the count for that election, Sonia Anderson said to me, "What about you next year?" I hadn't thought about being a councillor at all. I was never going to not be active politically, but I had no particular ambitions that I'd thought of. Oh yes, it sounds interesting. As it happens, one thing that had happened to me in early on, I had had TB. That had been treated originally. This was in 1952, but there was a slight recurrence in 1962, and so I had to withdraw. I would have been standing in the first election for the new Latin Bush ward. I had to withdraw from that, so I didn't. I was treated in hospital, and the TB was completely cured, and of course I'm still here today. And I went on to 1965, when there wasn't a vacancy in Latin Bush, but I did put myself up for what was then Great Parndon, but incorporated a number of the what are now separate wards, this area and a big area, and I stood for that together with Mervyn Jouliffe, because there were 2 seats available, and I lost by a very small margin. In fact, I think after about 3 recounts it was 17 votes in it. So anyway, 66, I was selected for Latin Bush, and I did serve that for 14 years.
So what did you like most about being a councillor?
Simply the ability to help to make decisions on things. I like to believe that I had the ability to do that, to see what was important in a particular situation.
And parallel to that was your commitment to peace.
Yes.
Commitment to world peace. Where we've obviously talked the line from Keir Hardie to Stan Newens to Hardie, but where did that come from, and what did you exactly tell people what exactly you did to?
Well, yes. I was working in the aircraft industry from in my first work. Obviously, during the war, I was helping produce warplanes, but with a family background, it's not simply political. I mean, the Independent Labour Party opposed the First World War, and my father was never in the forces. He had fitness problems during the First World War. He had to do war work, but he had very bad varicose veins, which ruled him out of being. He was already quite old anyway. Wasn't but 20 years, already in his 30s, and even when conscription came in, so it was just a natural corollary of my whole attitude, and we had the immediate euphoria in 1945 that we were looking forward to a world of peace and plenty, and the 1945 Labour manifesto, Let Us Face the Future, which I still have my copy of, talked about exactly that, and the setting up of the United Nations and so on. But by 1949, 50, 51, things were already changing. The Cold War was burgeoning, the Korean War was in the offing, and in 1949, I can date precisely actually my very first activity of this kind, having finished my apprenticeship and become a qualified junior draftsman, I joined the Draftsmen's Union. I'd been a member of the AEU as an apprentice, the Engineering Union, but as a draftsman I was a member of the Association of Engineering and Shipbuilding Draftsmen. Went along to my first meeting and put forward a motion opposing the proposed rearmament, which was starting at the time, saying I don't have the actual text, so I don't remember, but I went along with the brashness of youth, or fully prepared to put forward all the sort of arguments I thought I needed, that we must put our efforts into peaceful production for the benefit of people, not killing machines. And in fact, I was carried unanimously. A very different situation, I'm sad to say, with trade unions today. So anyway, that was my first ever activity. And then, around about the same time or a little later, I became a founder member of the Wolverhampton District Peace Council. Some local people were setting this up, and obviously I was interested. And so I went along there. And as I say, became a founder member. And to illustrate my thinking, I like to believe that although I have certainly emotional considerations. I mean, the whole idea of killing and everything is an emotional matter, but I like to think that I'm a fairly deep thinker as well. And as a new organisation, we needed a constitution. I proposed that we ought to include in that constitution a clause about studying the causes of war. Now, my colleagues didn't agree. Oh no, peace is so obviously better than war. All we've got to do is keep on convincing people that is so. And so we didn't get that clause. Now, of course, it really was a bit very naive on my part to think that a tiny group of self-appointed people could solve the problems that have taxed the greatest minds in history about how to prevent war and so on. So, as I say, I was very naive as well. Nevertheless, In fact, the military historian Michael Howard has argued that there are no causes of war, only causes of wars. A subtle but significant difference. Well, I'm not sure that's quite true. I think there are some sort of underlying factors which are always there. However, that's was the situation at that time, and so 1951, I left Bolton Paul Aircraft, which is where I had been working in Wolverhampton, moved down to London to pursue my career, in particular my scientific things. I had to do before I could even start doing a physics degree, I had to do quite a lot of other things because I didn't have any conventional O-levels and A-levels. I had ordinary and higher national certificates in mechanical engineering. They didn't count for anything. So I had to do O and A levels independently, various ways, and to qualify. But I went on doing various jobs in the drawing office for a number of years while I was becoming active in the Labour League of Youth and met Stan Newens, among other things, and got married and had my first child, and eventually managed to get my physics degree, whence I then moved out to Harlow, as I've already said.
The Labour Party that you're a member of, what's been, in your opinion, in your 90 years, what's been the high points, and what would you say have been perhaps the low points?
Well, the high point was undoubtedly 1945, and the immediate aftermath of that, despite all the troubles, there's no doubt about it, that the Attlee government worked wonders in many ways. It was subject to all sorts of opposition, the Housewives' League. I mean, it was a hard time. With the rationing went on for a long time, but the setting up of the welfare state and the NHS are undoubtedly wonderful achievements. Low point, the Iraq War, I suppose. And also the black point on the Attlee government was the nuclear weapons.
Because both must have crystallised, almost a coming together of your two great, I guess you mentioned Iraq, your two great causes, A, the Labour Party, and B, world peace or prevention of war. And Iraq must have almost a reverse, both your fears, I guess.
Yes.
Did you not say you took it personally, but you must have been very angry.
Oh, I was, undoubtedly. I was on the Great March, of course, in February 2003. The banner that I carried at that time with my wife was said, "Disarm the world, not only Iraq."
Moving forward to present day for a little bit, here in Harlow, only a few years ago, I think they were struggling to get candidates for all the wards, and now every weekend, they've got a waiting list for Labour candidates and councillors, but also they're out and about every weekend. Things, the world of social media, Twitter and Facebook, which that must encourage you that they're in good hands.
Yes, we still have difficulty getting women candidates. Because we're committed to equality.
Although, to be fair, in Harlow, there's Emma Toll. The two of the three by-elections, we'll skip over the reason for the by-elections.
Yes.
But Shannon Jezard, Francis Mason.
Yes, that's right.
So that's encouraging, isn't it?
But that's because we've had to. I mean, yes, there have always been very strong women, Sonia Anderson, Renee Morris, Jean McAlpine, Laura's aunt or great aunt.
So that must encourage you as well to see a prospective parliamentary candidate who is a woman as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we had three. Well, we had, they were all women candidates. It had to be an all women selection. Many people in the party, including many of the women, don't really like being forced to have an all women selection. But nevertheless, there's no doubt about it that we've still got some way to go to have equality, and so many of us sort of reluctantly accepted as a necessity at the present time, but we don't like it as a permanent matter.
Going back to war for a second, back in about 2004 when Reagan died, I was actually in America, and ski instructors with America up in Colorado, he said to me, "Ronald Reagan, the man who defeated communism." And for a minute I thought, but then again, I was 10,000 feet up and he might have pushed me off. But was that an odd way for people to see the end of wars or the end of the Cold War? A bit more complicated than that, wasn't it?
It was certainly more complicated than that. And in fact, it certainly was not true that the United States won the Cold War. In fact, the Cold War never really ended. It subsided considerably, and there are many people in American academics who criticize very strongly what the United States did when the wall came down and everything, that they could have helped Russia as it became to recover from all the things. The Soviet Union collapsed obviously for a whole range of reasons, but including the amount they spent on military instead of providing consumer goods to improve the well-being of their people. The United States, although it has plenty of poverty itself, but the United States can afford its military-industrial complex and still do all the consumer goods for the majority. But the Soviet Union couldn't.
The Labour Party at the moment is probably at a key point in its history, isn't it? That is the Labour Party at the moment under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party closer to what you're most comfortable with, whether it's, we mentioned Attlee, etc.
Yes, I voted for Jeremy. I count him as a friend. I've known him for many years. But I'm not an uncritical friend. Some of the things that are said about him, I think, are valid. He isn't decisive enough. Although I'm always sceptical about great charismatic leaders anyway, but nevertheless, I do sadly think that he is not decisive enough in putting forward not so much about Brexit as such, but in promoting the idea of a better world, whether we're on a better Britain and in a better world, whether we're in or out of the European Union. And I think that's what the Labour Party should be doing at this time.
We got to 29 minutes of this interview, Frank, without mentioning the dreaded B word, Brexit. So, has this brought? Do you think Brexit has brought out the worst in people?
It has indeed, yes.
Because the day after, I'll expand on your answer. But the day after the referendum, Sky News went to Old Harlow, and they went to a cafe in Old Harlow, and they said to a woman, "Which way did you vote?" She said, "Leave." "Why did you vote Leave?" She said, "Because I just want to be amongst our own." And that as would you not say that as an example of bringing out the worst in people?
Yes.
Because Harlow is very much a cosmopolitan, especially nowadays. Isn't it?
Nowadays, not so much in its earliest days. But yes, and I welcome the fact that we are a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual. It makes so much variety, and just look at the way the food. For example, you can go to any high street and you'll find the most exotic food you can imagine, and go back to the time when you couldn't get a cafe open after about 4:30 if you were on holiday. And
so, what do you hope for Brexit? How do you hope it ends?
I still have a slight hope that we might manage to stop it. I have always argued. I had a letter in the Observer well before the actual referendum, pointing out that the left generally had always had an ambivalent attitude towards the European Union, and rightly so. There are genuine pros and cons about the European Union. There are many things, valid criticism of the European Union, but on balance, taking all those into account, the idea of cooperation among the countries of Europe, now 28, and going to try probably only 27, is an enormous advantage on what has taken place historically, and that has never come out in the debates.
Finally, you're still I think the last time I saw you was the by-election. You were at one of the polling stations in Perfect Green. So you're still happy to be active. You're still happy to be an active member of the Labour Party.
Yes.
And is it? You can't force everybody to be a member of political parties, but would you encourage young people, ages of 18 or whatever age, to maybe get involved?
Yes.
And why?
Because it seems to me that it is a part of a citizen's duty to be involved in, not necessarily political party as such, but in some sort of societal activity. And the political parties encapsulate, as opposed to single issue matters, the political parties encapsulate one's whole attitude towards how one wants the world to work.
And you're going to continue much as far as you can.
Yes.
Brilliant. Can I just say thank you very much for your time, Frank? It's been great to interview you.
Mm-hmm.